How can people recognize burnout if it's not super clearly defined?
It's good to understand what you act like, how you feel, how you think when you're not burnt out. So for some people, that might be really difficult to remember, but there's a gradual onset of burnout. It's not usually one big thing and then suddenly you're burnt out, but start to recognize, okay, are you more tired that sleep doesn't resolve? Are you feeling more negative about your situation and other people's intentions? Or are you feeling less confident in your own abilities? Even if you are performing well, you don't believe you are. I think those tend to be the types of changes that people notice initially.
Ever felt like your creative sparks vanished, like you weren't performing your best and you just couldn't figure out why? Today we're discussing burnout with Sabrina Ahmed, and she's a burnout coach, she's a neuroscientist, and she's here to help you not only spot and prevent burnout, but also discover how to truly recover, even if you feel like maybe you've not hit rock bottom. So thanks for being here, Sabrina. And let's start at the obvious, really. So what is burnout?
Yeah, that's quite a big question, I think. But if I try and simplify it, essentially it's classed as a workplace phenomenon. And I think more and more the research seeing it show up in other parts of life. And classically, it's essentially a cluster of 3 different symptoms. So it's the physical, emotional exhaustion, cynicism and detachment, and feeling ineffective and like you're not achieving what you want to. So that's what makes that combination is what makes it slightly different to chronic stress.
Yeah, because is it correct to say that burnout's not a medical condition
No.
like depression? So is it a fair description to say that it's a symptom that arises from stress that you haven't managed?
Essentially, it definitely isn't classed currently as a medical condition, but it is this cluster of symptoms. I think it's at a very high level stress that you haven't managed, but I think more and more the research is showing there are external risk factors, which are either cultural or environmental, but there's also internal risk factors, so certain personality traits or how you relate to yourself and others, that can make you more susceptible to burnout. And that's why you can be in the same situation as someone else, but not everyone necessarily burns out.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. I was talking to another creative on the podcast, and he used to work 16 hours a day. And eventually the discussion led to he did experience burnout, but he'd done it for 20 years.
Yes.
He kept going for 20 years before it became a problem. So it's interesting to hear that there are these other factors.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that makes it hard for people that do burnout. Like I've had habitual burnout, 25 plus years in financial services, very kind of ripe for people that do burnout, but also people that can push themselves really hard for a really long time. So there's this kind of cultural expectation that you push yourself, and some people can do that for a long time. Eventually it does catch up with them. But then for other people where they might have this combination of different risk factors, they do struggle. And then you see other people who aren't necessarily publicly struggling, and that then adds pressure as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. You've touched on your own history with burnout. That's really what's interested me in this subject as well, experiencing the past burnout. It's just interesting to talk about these factors that there's probably some misconceptions about burnout that everyone experiences in the same way, and it comes from these same kind of pressures of being in a high pressure environment and doing lots of work. So how can people recognize burnout if it's not super clearly defined?
I think it's good to understand what you act like, how you feel, how you think when you're not burnt out. So for some people, that might be really difficult to remember, but there's a gradual onset of burnout. It's not usually one big thing and then suddenly you're burnt out. I describe it as death by 1,000 cuts. And everyone has their own burnout pattern. And this is something I've been looking into more when I work with clients and the research. And often these are just coping strategies with either it's high workload, which is traditionally what people think drives burnout, but it could also be a misalignment of your values. So you're in an environment where you're doing work, but it doesn't actually mean anything to you personally. Or it could be unprocessed loss and you're being a busy bee just to avoid feeling very difficult feelings. So I think it's much more complex than people realize. But I would say along those 3 symptom clusters, you might have your individual pattern, but start to recognize, okay, are you more tired that sleep doesn't resolve? Are you feeling more negative about your situation and other people's intentions? Or are you feeling less confident in your own abilities? Even if you are performing well, you don't believe you are. I think those tend to be the types of changes that people notice initially. Some people will have more of one than the other, like they feel it very physically and emotionally, whereas other people really start to kind of challenge their own confidence. Or you get people that complain all the time. They're the ones that really get impacted from a cynicism, detachment perspective.
So maybe we can talk about, you touched on that slightly. What are the common misconceptions of burnout?
I'd say the biggest one is excessive workload. I think there are excessive workload. If you're not managing your workload and resting enough and restoring yourself enough, you are going to struggle, but you may not necessarily get burnout. The other aspect I think people don't necessarily understand, like I mentioned, is that peak brand values or identity, or that what you do actually contributes anything. I think the three different kind of burnout types, there's this kind of over extended burnout, which is traditionally what you get with high workload, not enough rest. But there is also this burnout where you're just not able to function and you're not motivated. And that tends to be more where you don't have that connection to what you're doing. And then you have another type of burnout where you aren't connected to, or you don't feel like you're making that impact. So I would look at various different aspects of your work and what you're doing and whether you feel engaged. And that's really the opposite end of that burnout spectrum. If you're feeling really engaged, you can get through a difficult period. You're still motivated, you still feel like you're having a positive impact. That's really what you're aiming for. And if you're starting to lose some of that, then you're probably getting closer to burnout. And again, there are lots of different external risk factors that aren't just related to workload.
That's interesting. Maybe we can touch on those then. What are the kind of I think you mentioned cultural and environmental factors that can lead to it?
Yeah, there's certain aspects around you work hard, you don't rest, and you suck it up. That's a strong cultural message to give to people, especially in certain industries. So people internalize that and then they find it harder to take a break or take a rest. So again, that's influencing and changing their behavior. Lack of reward is another one. Again, if you're in an environment where you're seeing other people might be rewarded, but you're not, that's another reason that kind of might impact how you see yourself or how you see your work. A lack of community. I work with business owners and solopreneurs, and often they really struggle with loneliness and they don't feel connected, and they might not have people that they can talk to about the things they're challenged with. So again, that's another impact, an external risk factor. And yeah, a lack of fairness. So if you're seeing other people are being kind of assessed in a different way to you, that's just another kind of cause that might drive how you see yourself, how others relate to you, and things like that. And all of these are stressors in and of themselves. They just start to layer one on top of each other. And if you've got these internal risk factors as well, it all starts to lead you down that burnout spectrum.
Okay, so I mean, we spoke a little bit about the factors and how to recognize. The ideal is really that we would avoid getting to a crisis point,
Yeah.
and maybe a point where you'd need a coach to help you recover from this. So maybe we can chat a little bit. How can people prevent ever getting to a point of burnout?
So I'd say start being very self-aware. So notice if your thoughts have changed, if your habits have changed emotionally, if you're feeling different, so if you're starting to isolate, if you're getting more irritated, if you're resorting to drink, drugs, comfort food. All of these are coping mechanisms for an increased stress perception and feeling under pressure. And I would really start with the biological aspects. Being a neuroscientist, I was thinking about physically what's going on, as well as the mindset piece. And I would say there are three main areas to focus on. So sleep, making sure you're getting enough sleep and rest. Before you can really do any more significant mindset behavior change, you need to feel energized enough, because change is very expensive for the brain. And you're probably under pressure anyway, you're quite tired. I would always prioritize sleep and good quality rest, making sure you're well nourished as well. So again, give your body as much fuel that you need, reduce things like unprocessed foods, sugars, make sure you're hydrating well with water, and also connect a bit more, because we're social creatures. We need a bit of that support from others if we're struggling. So we try and find a trusted friend, whether it's at work, in your network, at home, and start to confide in them, if you can, just how you're feeling. So I think half the time when it's in your head and you're trying to deal with it alone, it feels worse often. So someone else can give you a bit of that comfort and help you recognize, actually, I've noticed these changes. Do you need support? If you want to start doing a bit more gentle exercise, I'll partner with you, whatever that support is that you need. I think not isolating yourself is a really important way of protecting yourself from not just burnout, but any kind of mental or physical health issue.
Talking about how people should really pay attention to their behaviors. So I think obviously part of struggling with burnout is not really realizing when it's happening. So how can people be aware that they're not just having a bad day or a bad week, and this is something more deeper that they should address?
Yeah, I would get them to reflect on how long they've felt like this. Since you can often get through kind of what they talk about, acute stress. We're built to deal with acute stress. Our bodies are actually pretty good at it. It's when it turns into chronic stress, so over weeks and months. If you're noticing your sleep is affected, you're coming up with coping strategies that you wouldn't normally do if you're on holiday or if you're resting. Start to notice if you're feeling like this over weeks and months, because then it's potentially going to turn into something that's more habitual and not as much of a short-term stress push, and then it will start to ease off.
I mean, because we all have those periods in kind of our work life.
Yeah.
Or you've got a big deadline, you've got a project, maybe it's like a month of stress or whatever, but if that external stressor goes away and it's continuing, then it's something that we might need to look at.
Exactly. I think a lot of burnout happens where there's a relentlessness and a lack of control. That's another external factor. So if you don't have as much autonomy or control over your workload or where you're getting clients or being able to make sales, that's another stressor, because your brain can't predict how much energy it might need to use for the task at hand. So then it starts to look at all different options, and you become a bit more anxious and start doing more than you probably should be doing.
The advice is really, it's a lot of the similar advice to living a happy life.
Yeah.
Like, live well, look after yourself, have a community around you.
Mhm.
So it's just interesting if you were to study, like, how can I be super productive and creative and reach the peak? It's also the same advice that it is to recover from a low period as well. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of mental health disorders or mental and physical issues, they might manifest in different ways, but they're often driven by the same problems. And a lot of them are lifestyle, society, choices we make. And we live very differently to the way our ancestors did. They had different issues to deal with, but modern life is very tough for us physically and mentally. I think if you think about a Victorian person would read or absorb the amount of data that is equivalent to a newspaper in current times, that would be how much they consume in their whole lifetime. So our brain have had to adjust quite significantly to the amount of data we're trying to process now. So I'm not surprised that people are kind of manifesting all these different symptoms, because we're just not looking after ourselves well enough in the way that we know thousands of years of life has fostered. There's a reason why there's a community around you. Make sure you rest well. These aren't novel new ideas. We've just forgotten them and ignored them. We don't think we need them, when actually we still do.
One of the things that I've noticed recently, like I did a little experiment, and that was remove myself from social media 95%. And the more I've looked into it, like it had a huge impact on me, like way more than I was expecting.
Yeah.
It actually made a really big difference. And the more I've researched, the more I've learned about the kind of the neuroscience behind that.
Yeah.
Is that something that you work with people, getting them to deconnect from their phone and do this dopamine detox kind of thing?
It really depends on where their concerns are. So I take a very person-centered approach. So I allow the client to determine where they want to prioritize, because often we have to make the choice of where to focus, because if there's not enough agency involved, it can be quite difficult for people to change their habits. For some people it is. I had one client who had a really unhealthy checking habit, which they developed over time. They were just constantly worried about not having enough money in the bank. So they'd wake up in the middle of the night and check their bank account, even though logically they knew it's not going to change from when I checked at 9 o'clock, but I have to check it at 2 a.m. So we worked on what was the root of that checking behavior, because a lot of this comes from fear, and the behavior is a way of calming ourselves, but it becomes a problem in itself. So often it's, okay, the symptom of the coping strategy might be the initial thing someone comes with. The type of therapeutic coaching I do allows us to go a little bit deeper into actually what's really happening that's making you take that choice. So again, it depends on what the client finds most troubling and what they feel most ready to tackle, because it's not always the most obvious thing that I might think. They have to be all ready to make the change.
There's one thing that I wanted to ask you about, just out of curiosity. And I think there's more and more science about like how much the bacteria in our gut affects our actions and our mood, and therefore the decisions that we make. Do you think that diet could be part of either a prevention or recovery from burnout?
I think there's more and more evidence around, especially metabolic disorders, so things like anxiety and depression. They're saying the science is shifting in terms of why those might be triggered or initiated. Healthy microbiome has a massive impact on the gut-brain axis, essentially. There's a lot of nerve cells going between one to the other. And the gut bacteria release certain chemicals, which then go through our system, can get through the blood-brain barrier, which tends to try and protect our brain from external things. And then that's what can influence certain behaviors. And the other way around, the brain starts to recognize, oh, there's certain things missing from the bloodstream, then I need to go and seek them out. So that's often how that might work. But more and more they're seeing the lack of diversity and kind of the wrong types of bacteria in our gut. The modern living, based on the diets we have, stress, what we're drinking, what we're eating, we're not getting enough rest, again, is probably contributing to some of these kind of health disorders that we have. Compared to people maybe in the third world or in other parts of the world where they have this very different diet and lifestyle, they don't have necessarily a lot of these same issues around health.
That's interesting. They have more of a reduced diet than actually in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also bacteria, we're always seen as the bad guys, and viruses as well. We have trillions in our body, all across different organs, that play a really important role. And proliferation of antibiotics and other kind of medication that we thought was good at the time has had all these other adverse effects. So I think it's good there's more research and there's more normal everyday information coming out around how important it is. And if you just eat completely differently for a week, you notice the impact. So imagine doing that over years.
I think it's fascinating. Like, we've touched on it a little bit, but I don't think people do the basics. We know how to live healthy and all this is thing. Maybe we just don't fully understand the science between the gut brain things yet, but like the things that you've said, like the way that we used to live in the past that was healthy, we've just moved away from that in modern culture, and it is having impacts, I believe.
Yeah, and I see it in myself, and I think this is the challenge we have. Even if you know something, applying it to your life is difficult sometimes. I've got a phone. I like YouTube as much as else. If there's a topic, and I think this is the challenge, if you're a very curious person, it's very easy to get sucked into, okay, I've got to get more knowledge, because not the acquisition of knowledge it can be rewarding for some people as well. And social media is literally built to do that. It's gamified so that you get lots of new knowledge and you get even more knowledge. And so they're built with neuroscientists, so they know how we work. It's really about how can you use your environment to make a different habit easier to support.
Yeah, like personally, I fall into that category. I've separated it in my mind, at least set some boundaries, like the YouTube short videos, the reels, like no, 100% no. And then the longer form, the 20-minute video, like we're still getting that dopamine hit and learning something. And if we're not careful, we just slip into it's entertaining. Yeah. We're not actually learning. We're just watching entertainment and feel like we're learning.
Yeah.
Taking the action, right?
Yeah. And most of this is about intention. So are you using it because you've done a lot of focus work? You just need a distraction. I call it mental chewing gum, and it's fine in targeted ways. In my day job, I read a lot of contracts and heavy text stuff. So sometimes I want to look at cat videos because they're just easy. But it's when it starts to be, a distraction because of emotional discomfort, or you don't want to do something hard. So it's just easier to waste half an hour on some social media platform. And then you start feeling guilty and beat yourself up over wasting time. That's when you start to look at what you're doing and to think, okay, is this the best use of my time? Do I constantly want to keep beating myself up over not achieving my goals, whether it's being more creative or meeting friends or booking a holiday? I think it's really trying to step back and understanding why you're doing certain things. And if there's a targeted reason and a time boxed amount, that's fine. When it's becoming mindless and an avoidance strategy, that's where I pay attention.
You touched on this topic, setting goals and moving towards your goals. I'd imagine that when you're feeling burnout, your motivation's at the lowest.
Yeah.
That's not really the top of your list. Does goal setting and things like that appear in your work when you're coaching people with burnout?
Not necessarily in probably the traditional coaching way, because I see it in I see burnout through this kind of recovery playbook that I'm pulling together, where there's lots of different factors. So for me, I don't want to jump in saying you need to create a SMART goal and blah, blah. I think people are more complex than that sometimes, especially when they're burnt out. Because like you said, keeping up with work and family and the rest of it might be just the limit of where they are. So then trying to add another bunch of pressures to change, which is expensive physically and mentally, doesn't necessarily help, which is why I think I would always try and start small. We go back to those kind of recovery themes, if it's sleep or diet or movement, hydration, connection. I'd always pick one and focus on it. And make it very simple. Okay, I'm going to try and go to bed 15 minutes earlier or half an hour earlier. And that's the one thing you focus on that week. Because for some people, that is hard. So I'm less focused on like the very, very traditional goal setting approach, because I just don't think it necessarily works for people that are in a very kind of exhausted state. And that's generally why I tend to start with maybe that biological aspect. Again, if that's something that they want to focus on. Other people they want to focus on a very difficult relationship they might have at work or the confidence issue they have. But yeah, I tend to try and make it very small and simple for people so it's achievable.
One thing I know you do help people with, and that's resilience. So obviously not all stress is bad. If you're going to achieve a goal, then you're going to have to go through some stress to get there. So how can people be more resilient? And is that a skill that we can develop?
Yes, it absolutely is a skill that we can develop. And I think that's where having growth mindset, which people have talked about a lot, but believing that you can change if you intentionally put effort into something, I think is a really important enabler. And I think resilience is different for every person, right? For some people, I'll be able to deal with a really difficult, high pressure meeting. For other people, it might be, I'm like really struggling to say no to my kids. It's making me react in a really unhelpful way. I think it's really up to the individual to determine what resilience is for them and what feeling non-resilient is, how that manifests for them. So is it you're in this very ruminative, circular thoughts in? Are you reaching out for comfort foods or drinks? Or are you feeling really emotionally overwhelmed? These things come out very differently in each person. So I think it's very important to notice we've got individual differences, really defining what resilience is for each of us. For me, I tend to get quite emotionally overwhelmed, and then my habits really change. So I end up seeking very distraction-based activity. And then that also, it's a vicious cycle, because then I get more tired and everything takes longer and so on. Really, for me, it's okay, when do I stop properly looking after myself? So being resilient for me is when I actually put myself first and don't get into the unhealthy habits cycle. Whereas for someone else, it might be quite different.
So let's talk about recovery a little bit, because we're all humans and unfortunately we often have to reach a crisis point before we start putting our health first. But firstly, is burnout always a negative thing, or can we reframe it?
There is definitely a movement there to reframe it. And I think any difficult experience, so there's both post-burnout growth, so a bit like kind of post-traumatic growth. Essentially, any negative or difficult change or experience that you go through, you actually might learn and reflect a lot and gain some insights about what got you to that stage. And what they find is often some people have a real personal growth kind of epiphany and decide to make changes in their lives. It's very difficult to not keep burning out if you're in the same environment that doesn't work for you, which is difficult sometimes from an ego perspective, right? I don't want to not be able to work in a certain industry because it's too hard, because I'm really good at X, Y, Z. Sometimes you need to take that difficult choice and say, you know what, I'm not built for that environment. I've tried, I keep burning out or I keep feeling unhappy. What else can I do? What would give me more satisfaction from a values or a skills basis? So I think there is a lot of that post burnout growth. I know that for myself, sometimes I have to sacrifice and take certain jobs or actions because we all have bills to pay. But also it's made me really realize what my values are, the type of work I want to do in the future, how I want to help people. Writing every week with my insights, there's different ways in which you can actually use your knowledge and your experience to, reframe the experience and make it useful for yourself or for others in your environment.
Yeah, I think makes sense. And you can see it as a kind of a moment of kind of rebirth, just change, really. We all go through periods of change in our life. Ideally, you probably wouldn't want to have to go through burnout to change your path, but sometimes it's just human nature.
Exactly. And those insights I write on Substack. And it's really interesting when you get comments and someone says, oh, I didn't know that, or I really feel that really resonated. That is really satisfying in a way, because you think, oh, wow, my experience has actually helped someone feel connected and seen. And actually they're not going to beat themselves up as much because they realize actually this is quite a common experience for a lot of people. So I think any experience, like you said, as humans, you can reframe it into something kind of positive, even if it's some horrendous thing that you've had to go through. It's the human condition. So the more we kind of share and talk about our experiences.
Going back to this point of resilience and having the growth mindset, what positive can we take away from?
Yeah, exactly. And that can really determine how well people recover, how quickly they recover, how long they are in recovery, whether they'll make the same mistakes or get into those same kind of unhealthy habits. It makes a big difference.
So how do people go about recovery from burnout?
Like I said, I would always start with probably the biological aspect, because any kind of change or undoing an unhealthy habit is expensive for the brain. It really likes to take the path of least resistance, which is why we get stuck in these unhealthy habits, even if we don't want to do them. So it's about what can you do to really give yourself a fighting chance to make that positive change last. So again, I would say focus on sleeping and resting enough, you eating well enough, again, help your microbiome do the best it can. Hydrate. I think a lot of people don't realize how important water and hydration is and how that impacts their fatigue and concentration and attention, connection with others, exercise. You don't have to be super gym bunny that's doing 45-minute circuits a day. Find what works for you, especially if you're on the road to burnout. It can be quite tiring. So, even just a morning stretch, if that's all you can do, still makes a difference. Something creative. So I know you're interested in creativity, but I find doing something creative is a really good way to get into flow state, bring your kind of stress levels down, and allows you to get a bit of perspective on your experience as well.
Yeah, my background's, I call myself creative. My background's in motion design.
Right.
And actually, I was feeling burnt out. That kind of passion went away because that's what I do for a career.
Job for you. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was difficult to refine that. But I mean, things that worked for me were basically prioritizing health.
Yeah.
Looking at basics, doing the basics right. And if you research what are the basics, a lot of the time people talk about mindfulness, journaling, the exercise, obviously, and then dopamine detox, things like that.
Yeah. I think that processing activities, so things like you said, journaling, mindfulness, are really good tools to use, because they help you get perspective from your experience. And what you want to do is be able to express your experience without judgment. And that's really what will help you start to bring yourself out of that distressed state. I really like journaling, so I've become an art-based coach as well. So that was one way I brought my creativity into that kind of therapeutic coaching space. And it's really powerful. You're creating art not for creating good art, but actually using a visual language to express what's going on for you. So it's just another form of journaling, but just through visual language.
Tell us a little bit more about that, because I don't really know a lot about that.
It's quite relatively new. And obviously humans have been using art for thousands of years to express how they feel. For me, I've always been quite artistic and I've always been quite sciencey. So even though a very science and psychological based coaching approach. I always missed doing the creative part. And I found a trainer who brings the two together. And it's a really great way of understanding what's in our unconscious, things that are bubbling there in the background that you don't necessarily consciously recognize. But going through a guided meditation and then creating something, mark making off the back of that, then you have time to actually look at your image and every choice you've made, every color you've used, every tool you've chosen. All of those speak to your inner state, and you'll start to have a slightly external perspective to things that maybe have been like held inside. And it's a really transformative experience. It tends to get deeper much quicker because you're not censoring like we do with language and speech. And when you're creating, it's something that children do naturally all the time. And we lose that ability a lot as we get older. So it's really tapping into that kind of natural inclination we have to be creative.
I think creators would find that really useful. I mean, my problem is like when you're creative, you solve it's commercial creativity. You're solving a problem in a brief, and then that the output will be evaluated by the client, other people, and stuff like that. And the joy of probably why you got into the creative industry is probably been lost a little bit, maybe.
I was about to say that often, and I've had this as well, where they call it that creative wall that you hit, where you lose the joy of creating just for the hell of it because it's become a commoditized act, something that's quite difficult to get back into it. And often I found creatives working in different creative medium is a way of tapping into it. So if you're like a graphic designer on a computer, sometimes actually using pastels or paint or something very different that they wouldn't necessarily do on a day-to-day basis is a great way to tap back into joy for the heck of creating.
Yeah. As creatives, you're always taught to put our work out there as well. And like the thing that comes up quite often is perfectionism.
Yeah.
We pair the work that we create to other people.
Yeah. In your head, right?
But it's an interesting concept, like creating for the joy of it. And you don't have to share it with anyone.
No, exactly. And that's the thing with art-based coaching. You're not creating it to create a piece of art. I used to publish my art journals weekly on X just as a bit of an experiment. If I was creating a piece of art, then they don't look like my art. So there's a very different purpose, reason. I'm not sitting there thinking, you know what, the colors need to perfectly match. And there's this whole concept. It's, you know what, I feel really sad today. I want to express what's going on. And when I reflect and do my kind of self-reflection on it, that's when you start to get insights and you do the meaning making. So it's a very different process. It allows you to let go of that perfectionism because it is your visual language. We don't necessarily sit there and kind of over perfect every single word we're saying. I'm quite nervous now because we're having an interview. But generally, it's trying to shift you from that kind of perfectionist mode into express what comes out without censorship and judgment. And then let's reflect on what it's actually trying to say to you.
I want to circle back a little bit because you said something that made me think of this question, something that I hadn't thought about. And it was like, what was the reason for burnout? And I'd never thought to ask myself that question. Maybe we can explore that a bit. As a professional, what are the reasons for burnout? How can people find the reasons that led them to burnout?
I would say, again, consider your coping strategies or your burnout patterns. So from the research and things that I've read and people I've worked with, it tend to be 8 burnout patterns. So it could be the busy bee, the perfectionist, which we've talked about, the comfort seeker, the marching soldier, carry on, can't be vulnerable, keep going. I think how you react to stress and the coping strategies you put in place can give you a clue as to what your drivers might be. So I know for me, I would really lean into perfectionism and busy bee because I would often feel threatened at work of not wanting to make mistakes, not wanting to be called out as not an expert. There's a lot of self-esteem, fear of failure, fear of being rejected, those types of issues for me. I would go into this hyperdrive of got to do everything, got to do it perfectly. Let me review my PowerPoint 60,000 times so that no one calls out anything in the meeting. And you might find that actually there's certain signs in terms of how you're coping and the unhealthy patterns you're putting in place that can help you determine, okay, actually, maybe it's that. I don't feel like I'm in a psychologically safe place, or there's a lot of pressure on me from other people in my team. I don't feel supported. Or I've just got so much work to do, I'm not resting, and it's always on my mind. I think breaking it down in that way helps you understand actually what are the causes and the reasons that are, stopping you in working in the best way.
Do you think there's a formula for recovering from burnout, or is it different for each person?
I think there are certain recovery strategies, like some of the ones I've mentioned, but I would say there's like a bespoke formula in which it's up to the individual and me as a coach, if I'm working with someone, how you put that together. So like I said, for some people, sleep isn't an issue. They're eating pretty well. The physical aspect is okay. So there's something else going on. And so it could be they've got a real self-esteem challenge and it's making them not be as effective as the leader. Maybe they're not able to, challenge a difficult team member or an employee. And that's making them feel like they have to overwork and compensate for something that's going on. So I would say it's quite individual to the person. There are certain themes and there are common patterns, but your specific recovery strategy might be different to someone else's. And the people I've worked with, there's never been one solution that works across the board.
Is it often like a multiple, a multifaceted thing that you do all at once?
Yeah, like I said, I would help someone prioritize the area they want to focus on. And like I said, there are different recovery strategies. So for some people, it might be social connection based. For some people, it might be exercise and biology focused. For other people, it might be their mindset. So they're caught up in this very unhealthy kind of negative belief cycle. Or it could be very behavioral. So, they're starting to avoid things that they probably used to do. So you might want to do more of an exposure therapy or kind of behavioral activation approach. So there's a lot of tools and techniques, and it's definitely up to the individual to then create that kind of bespoke approach.
Yeah. I guess this is the other thing that we haven't overtly talked about, is that seeking out a therapist and someone to help you work through and out, that might be something people want to do.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just fine that you're struggling to see the wood for the trees and you just want someone to help you, guide you through the process. Definitely helps to reach out to someone. I've always found when it gets to that point in my life, it really helps to reach out to someone just to get that external perspective, their expertise. And often just having a conversation, people are like, oh, that's so obvious now, but you need to have the conversation to have the epiphany. So don't feel like you have to struggle in silence with this.
Awesome. So maybe you could give us one piece of advice. What advice would you like to leave the audience with?
Gosh, one piece of advice. I would say that burnout isn't inevitable. You can recover. So don't feel like you have to suffer in silence. You can do something about it and you don't have to do it alone.
So that leads very nicely. So if people are curious about maybe looking into art therapy, or they want help with finding the reasons that they burn out, or they just want to speak to a therapist, how can people get in contact with you or find out more about your work?
So I directing everything to my Substack, which is called Build a Better Brain. It's at articles.openintrovert.com. If you have a look there, you'll be able to get my details if you want to book a free kind of 25-minute discovery call, so we can talk about what's going on for you. I have a free kind of burnout risk quiz that people can take. So lots of resources there, lots of articles that help you dive into burnout, all the different aspects of it. So I would probably start there, and always feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions.
Awesome. I'll put those links in comments so if anyone check those out. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Luke. Appreciate you inviting me.
If you like this video, you love our weekly newsletter, sign up at designresources.ai.